important, talking about the studies that have been done about the reasons and the root causes of,
Right.
why Judaism is waning in certain areas, and you could make the argument that it's growing in others,
Hmm.
where it's waning in others. But there's um, something here that you said that the tension of belief and practice is not new. In fact, it is healthy, indeed necessary, for the continued flourishing of contemporary Jewish life. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think if you study the history of modernity and Jewish responses to modernity and the whole process of secularization that grew alongside the flourishing of Hasidic movements and revival movements of Jewish mysticism in Eastern Europe, you see over and over again these like different streams of interpretation of what it means to be Jewish and existing side by side and often in conversation with one another. In fact, the Reform movement, in some ways, some scholars argue, gave birth to Orthodoxy as a name and
Right.
also as an organized movement. That's a hallmark of Jewish history that's really fascinating to think about. No Jewish identity or movement or group or way of being or innovation or practice exists in a vacuum. People are always in conversation with one another, and that conversation to me is inherently fascinating and never dull.
Our argument that we made was having to deal with theism and the idea of theism being a part of Jewish identity and being something that perhaps needed to be brought back up
Right.
again.
And that from our perspective and our organization that we work with, we see that it's not addressed. And it's something
Uh-huh.
that's kind of left out of Jewish identity. And we feel strongly that maybe it shouldn't be.
My curiosity is that you sort of summarized our answer in the beginning and then said you weren't thoroughly convinced. So I'm wondering, does that have anything to do with the fact that you are a professor of secular Jewish society?
I talk a lot about theism and various Jewish beliefs about the divine in my classes. I'm always talking about Judaism as a religion, as well as Judaism and Jewishness as culture. I think what's really important, though, is to recognize that different Jews have different approaches to theism, and that there's a wide spectrum. It's a very wide-ranging and sometimes controversial and contested conversation.
There is this whole spectrum. And just because you're an atheist doesn't mean that there's no reason you can't engage in dialogue about it. So a non-dualist and an atheist and a believer in a personal deity all have a place in this conversation, and that we should rejoice that this conversation is something that we should be having.
To me, it seems like you're using the tools of technology and culture to facilitate those conversations, and one could make the argument that you yourselves are Jewish cultural producers in a theistic slant. You are using the vehicle of online community building to talk about the specific areas of concern that are passionate for you, but that's culture. I think that there's a lot of concern and conversation amongst Jewish studies scholars and amongst philanthropists for sure about how to address the needs and the desires and the concerns and the sensibilities of people who are post B'nai Mitzvah, not necessarily available or old enough for birthright, or even birthright, post birthright cohorts of people who are in their odyssey years of figuring out who they want to be as Jews by choice. I mean, everybody is a Jew by choice at this point. So how do we create pathways for engagement or viable, compelling, meaningful experiences to connect people with the rich legacy and treasury of Jewish culture and history and ideas and ritual and all of that? And in my other life, I run storytelling in Colorado. It is such a way to connect very deeply with the power of ancient Jewish text in a very performative, engaging, meaningful way that is about asking people questions, not providing answers. And to me, that's the ticket.